By dawn, one American Marine sergeant would fire more than 26,000 rounds through a single machine gun. His hands would burn through his gloves, his skin would burn through his palms. And when the sun came up on October 25, 1942, 38 Japanese soldiers would lie dead in a single heap just yards in front of his gun. His name was John Basilone. He was the son of an Italian tailor from Raritan, New Jersey. He was 24 years old, and in the next 4 hours, he would change the course of the Pacific War. But we have to go back a few hours first. Back to 2:30 in the morning. 2:30 in the morning. October 25, 1942. Guadalcanal. Sergeant John Basilone is kneeling in the mud behind a Browning 9917 machine gun. The barrel is so hot he can smell the oil burning off the metal. His hands are blistered raw. His uniform is soaked with rain and sweat and something darker that he does not want to think about. He has not slept in 36 hours. He has not eaten in longer than that. Through the darkness, he can hear them coming again. The sound starts low, a rustle in the elephant grass, a snap of vegetation, and then the screaming begins. Banzai, banzai. 3,000 Japanese soldiers from the Sendai division are charging straight at his position. They are running over the bodies of their comrades who charged an hour ago. They are climbing over their own dead like stepping stones across a river. Basilone presses the trigger. The gun chatters. Red tracers slice through the rain. Men drop. More men take their place. Somewhere behind the Japanese lines, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake is listening to the gunfire and waiting for the message that will announce the capture of Henderson Field. He has been promised this attack will succeed. He has 15,000 soldiers on Guadalcanal. He has artillery, he has tanks, he has the full backing of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He has Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself coordinating a massive fleet operation to support this ground assault. And he has the most important advantage of all. The Americans, everyone in Tokyo agrees, are soft. They are weak. They have no stomach for the kind of brutal close-quarters combat that is the specialty of the Japanese soldier. Hyakutake is certain that by sunrise, the American flag over Henderson Field will be replaced by the rising sun. He is wrong. In the next 72 hours, the attack on Henderson Field will become one of the most lopsided defeats in the history of the Pacific War. The Sendai Division, one of Japan's most experienced combat units, will be virtually annihilated. Bodies will stack so deep in the barbed wire that bulldozers will be required to bury them. The kill ratio will be so extreme that analysts in Washington will initially refuse to believe the reports. The Japanese are walking into a meat grinder, and they do not even know it. But before you can understand how this happened, you have to understand something stranger. You have to understand why the man who ordered this attack, the man behind the entire Japanese strategy at Guadalcanal, already knew that Japan was going to lose the war. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, 58 years old, Admiral of the Combined Fleet, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most famous naval commander in the Japanese Empire, and a man who, in the years before the war, had lived in the United States. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had driven across America. He had walked through the automobile factories of Detroit. He had watched the shipyards on the West Coast, churning out steel hulls like a bakery churning out bread. He knew what American industry could do. He had seen it with his own eyes. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had told the Japanese Prime Minister a warning that would echo through history. He said he could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, he had no confidence in ultimate victory. Now, in the autumn of 1942, that year was almost up. And Yamamoto knew that if the Americans were given time to build up their strength, Japan would be crushed beneath the weight of American factories. He knew Guadalcanal was the last chance to stop them. He knew this attack had to succeed. And yet he was ordering his men into a fight he understood. Better than anyone in Tokyo, they were probably going to lose. That is the paradox at the heart of this story. The man who understood America best was the man who ordered Japan to attack it. To understand why they attacked Henderson Field, you have to understand what that airfield actually was. And to understand that, you have to look at a map of the Pacific in the summer of 1942. The Japanese Empire in that moment was the largest in human history. It stretched from the frozen coasts of the Aleutian Islands in the north to the tropical jungles of New Guinea in the south, from the ruins of Singapore in the west to the tiny atolls of the Marshall Islands in the east. In 6 months, Japan had conquered more territory than Alexander the Great, more than Genghis Khan, more than Napoleon. But the empire had a weakness, and that weakness was oil. The Japanese war machine ran on oil, and the oil fields they had captured in the Dutch East Indies were thousands of miles from the home islands. The tankers carrying that oil had to sail through waters that were becoming more vulnerable every day. The Japanese needed to push their defensive perimeter farther south. They needed to cut the supply lines between the United States and Australia, and to do that they needed a single island at the southern end of the Solomon chain, Guadalcanal, a lush green nightmare of jungle, mountains, and disease, 90 miles long, 25 miles wide, home to a few thousand indigenous islanders and a handful of British colonial administrators. In May of 1942, Japanese construction crews arrived. They cleared the kunai grass. They laid down coral and gravel. They imported heavy equipment from Rabaul, bulldozers, steamrollers, concrete mixers. By early August, an airfield was almost complete on the northern coastal plain. If that airfield became operational, Japanese bombers could reach Australia. Japanese fighters could intercept any Allied ship trying to resupply the South Pacific. The entire strategic balance of the war would shift. The Americans could not let that happen. On August 7, 1942, 11,000 American Marines of the 1st Marine Division splashed ashore on Guadalcanal. It was the first American amphibious assault since the Spanish-American War. It caught the Japanese completely by surprise. The construction crews grabbed their rifles, fired a few rounds, then fled into the jungle. They left everything behind, everything. The bulldozers were still parked next to the runway. The steamrollers were still fueled. The concrete mixers were still full. The tools were still in their crates. Rice and sake and canned goods were stacked in warehouses. The Japanese had abandoned enough construction equipment to finish the airfield themselves, and that is exactly what the American Marines did. They took the machinery the Japanese had built the airfield with, and they used it to complete the runway. They took the bulldozers and graded the strip. They took the rollers and packed down the coral. Within days, the airfield that Japan had built to threaten Australia was ready to receive American aircraft to bomb Japan. The American Marines named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had died leading a bombing run at the Battle of Midway 2 months earlier. Henderson had gone in first because he did not want to send his men into fire he would not face himself. He was shot down within minutes. Now his name was carved into the mud of a Japanese airstrip on the far side of the world. The Japanese could not accept the loss. It was not just a strategic setback. It was an embarrassment. The Americans, who were supposed to be soft and decadent, had actually attacked. They had actually landed. They had actually taken something the Japanese had built. In Tokyo, the response was fury, and so began the Japanese counterattack. Not one attack, a series of them, each one bigger, each one more desperate, each one built on the same fatal assumption. The first came just 2 weeks after the American landing. His name was Kiyonao Ichiki, 49 years old, colonel in the Imperial Japanese Army, a man who had led troops in China and Manchuria, a man who believed with absolute conviction that Japanese spirit could overcome any obstacle. Ichiki was given command of a detachment that had originally been trained to invade Midway. When Midway was canceled, the detachment was redirected to Guadalcanal. Ichiki was told the Americans on the island numbered a few thousand at most. He was told they were demoralized. He was told they would break at the first sign of a determined night attack. He believed every word of it. On the night of August 20th, 1942, Ichiki led roughly 800 men across a sandbar at the mouth of a river the American Marines called the Tanaru. In truth, it was the Ilu River. The Marines had the name wrong on their maps, but the name did not matter to the men who died there. The American Marines were waiting. They had machine guns. They had barbed wire. They had 37mm cannon loaded with canister shot, which turned each round into a giant shotgun blast that could shred a dozen men at once. Ichiki's soldiers charged into the wire, screaming. They were cut down in seconds. A second wave charged. It was cut down. A third wave charged. It was cut down. By dawn, more than 750 Japanese soldiers were dead. The American Marines had lost fewer than 40 men. Colonel Ichiki gathered the remnants of his detachment behind the lines. He burned the regimental colors to prevent their capture. Then he sat down on the sand and shot himself. His last report to Rabaul sent before the attack had read simply, "The attack will be a great success." It was not. But in Tokyo, the meaning of the Tenaru was not understood. Ichiki's failure was blamed on Ichiki. He had been too impatient, they said. He had attacked with too few men. He had not properly appreciated the terrain. The lesson was not that the Americans were tougher than expected. The lesson was that next time, Japan would send more soldiers, and so the second counterattack began to take shape, larger, more coordinated, led by a general instead of a colonel. His name was Kiyotake Kawaguchi, 50 years old, Major General, and he would take 3,100 men into the jungle south of Henderson Field. The story of what happened to those men, and to the American Marines who were waiting for them on a nameless ridge in the darkness, is where this war truly began to turn. And it turned because the Japanese did not yet understand what they were fighting. They thought they were fighting men. They were fighting an airfield, a single dirt runway carved out of the jungle, a place they had built themselves, a place they had abandoned, a place that would, within months, become the graveyard of an empire. Henderson Field. The name meant nothing to Tokyo in August of 1942. By February of 1943, it would mean everything. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi looked at the maps spread across his field table and traced a line with his finger. South of Henderson Field, through the jungle, straight up the ridge that dominated the airfield from the rear. On paper, it was elegant. The American Marines had built their perimeter facing the sea. They expected the next attack to come from the water, the way Ichiki had come. They expected it from the north, from the east, from the coast. They did not expect it from the south. They did not expect it from behind. Because behind them was jungle, and the jungle was supposed to be impassable. Kawaguchi would prove it was not. He had 3,100 men, veterans, men who had fought in the Philippines, in Borneo, in the East Indies. He had orders from Rabaul that were direct and simple. Take Henderson Field, restore the honor of the empire, do not fail as Ichiki had failed. Kawaguchi began his march on September 5, 1942. His men carried rice and dried fish and ammunition on their backs. They carried mortars broken down into pieces. They carried machine guns wrapped in oilcloth. They had no vehicles. They had no pack animals. They had only their legs and the strength of the empire behind them. The march was supposed to take 4 days. It took 8. The jungle on Guadalcanal was not a place. It was a living thing. It was a green wall that closed behind you as you passed. It was roots that grabbed your ankles. It was vines that reached down and caught your rifle. It was leeches in your socks and mosquitoes in your eyes and rain that never ever stopped. The temperature was 95 degrees. The humidity was 100%. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Men fell behind and were left in the jungle. Radios failed in the wet air. Companies became separated from battalions. Battalions became separated from regiments. When Kawaguchi's men finally staggered out of the jungle south of Henderson Field on September 12th, they were half-starved, half-mad, and completely disorganized. And on the ridge above them, a man was waiting. His name was Merritt Edson, 45 years old, Lieutenant Colonel, Marine Raider. His men called him Red Mike because of his hair and his temper. He commanded the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, one of the toughest units in the American arsenal. Edson had studied Kawaguchi's likely approach. He had walked the terrain himself. He had chosen the ridge. Edson positioned 840 American Marines along 1,000 yards of open ground that ran south from the airfield. It was the last high ground before the Japanese would reach the runways. If it fell, Henderson Field fell with it. The attack came at dusk on September 12th. The Japanese emerged from the jungle screaming. They ran up the slope to waves. The American Marines cut them down with rifles and machine guns, and mortars zeroed on every approach. When the first wave died, a second wave came. When the second wave died, a third came. The screaming did not stop. The dying did not stop. All night, the ridge was a stroboscope of muzzle flashes and grenade blasts, and the smell of blood and cordite hung in the wet air like a curtain. By dawn, the ridge was still American. The next night, September 13th, Kawaguchi tried again, and this time he got close. The Japanese pushed the American Marines back to the last 200 yards of ridge before the airfield. Edson stood in the center of his line, upright, refusing to take cover, walking among his men in the middle of the fighting. He spoke to them one at a time. He said, "The only thing they've got that you haven't is guts." The line held. By the morning of September 14th, more than 830 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the slopes of the ridge. Kawaguchi's division had been shattered. The survivors staggered back into the jungle, carrying the wounded on their backs. They ate the last of their rice on the 3rd day. After that, they ate roots. The American Marines renamed the ridge Edson's Ridge. In Tokyo, the news arrived slowly, and when it arrived, it caused something worse than anger. It caused confusion. 2 attacks had now failed. 2 commanders had been broken by a single American perimeter. The problem, the Imperial General Staff decided, was not the enemy. The problem was the size of the Japanese effort. Send a division, they said. Send the best division we have. They chose the 2nd Infantry Division, the Sendai Division, recruited from Miyagi Prefecture in the north of Japan. Men from farming villages and fishing towns, known for their endurance, their discipline, their willingness to die. But the Sendai Division carried a scar that Tokyo did not want to mention. 3 years earlier, in 1939, the Sendai Division had been part of the Japanese force at a place called Nomonhan on the border between Manchuria and Mongolia. There they had fought the Soviet Red Army under a general named Zhukov. The Japanese had expected an easy victory. Instead, Zhukov had encircled them with tanks and artillery and destroyed them in a battle Japan had spent 3 years pretending had not happened. The Sendai Division had survived Nomonhan, but something had been broken there. A confidence, a belief in their own invincibility. The unit had been rebuilt. New men had been recruited. The colors had been restored. But the men who marched onto the ships bound for Guadalcanal in October of 1942 carried a memory in their bones that Tokyo did not know about. They had lost before. They knew how it felt. The transports were commanded by Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka. His destroyers were the fastest in the Pacific, and he used them to slip down the narrow waterway between the Solomon Islands under cover of darkness. The American Marines called the waterway the Slot, and they called Tanaka's runs the Tokyo Express. Every night, the express ran. Every morning, more Japanese soldiers stood on the beaches of Guadalcanal. By the middle of October, more than 15,000 Japanese troops were on the island. Artillery pieces had been dragged through the mud. Tanks had been landed on the sand. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake himself had arrived to take personal command. This time, the assault would not fail. But first, the airfield had to be broken. At 1:33 in the morning on October 14th, 2 Japanese battleships appeared off the coast of Guadalcanal. Their names were Kongo and Haru. They were the pride of the Imperial Navy. Their 14-inch guns fired shells that weighed more than 1,400 pounds each. Each shell was the size of a small car. Each explosion could shatter a house. For 83 minutes, the battleships fired. 918 shells fell on Henderson Field. The American Marines called it, forever after, simply the Bombardment. Pharmacist mate First Class Luis Ortega was in a pillbox when the first shells hit. He would later describe the sound this way: a whistling noise, and then boom. What the hell was that? And then another one. For the next 4 hours, we were bombarded. You can get a dozen air raids a day, but they come and they are gone. But when these battleship guns start lobbing shells into you, they come one after another. Men held their heads and screamed and could not hear themselves screaming. Men prayed and could not hear their own prayers. Men bit down on their belts and their rifle slings to keep from biting through their own tongues. The runway was torn apart. 48 of the 90 aircraft on the field were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Almost all of the aviation fuel burned in orange columns that rose 200 feet into the black sky. 41 men died, including 6 pilots. When the Japanese ships finally withdrew, Henderson Field lay in ruins. In Tokyo, Yamamoto received the report at his headquarters and allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The airfield was finished. The Cactus Air Force, the ragtag collection of American Marine and Navy and Army planes that had defended Guadalcanal, was destroyed. Now the ground assault could begin. But something had happened on Henderson Field in the hours after the bombardment that Yamamoto did not yet know about. The Marine engineers were awake. They had come out of their shelters with shovels and picks and gasoline drums. They had begun to fill the craters. They had begun to drag the wrecked aircraft off the runway. They had begun to pump gasoline from underground storage that the Japanese shells had missed. They worked without sleep. They worked without food. They worked in the mud and the rain and the smell of burning oil. By noon on October 15th, less than 12 hours after the last shell fell, Henderson Field was operational again. The remaining Cactus aircraft, patched together with parts scavenged from wrecks, roared down the repaired runway and took off into the daylight. They found what Yamamoto had sent to reinforce Guadalcanal: 6 Japanese transport ships still unloading soldiers and supplies on the beaches in broad daylight because everyone in the Japanese chain of command had believed Henderson Field was dead. The Cactus pilots put bombs into 3 of them. 2 burned. 1 exploded and settled to the bottom in shallow water, a cargo of ammunition still detonating hours later. The other 3 ships turned and ran, dumping unloaded supplies into the surf as they fled. Yamamoto's greatest weapon, the 14-inch guns of 2 battleships firing 918 shells for 83 minutes, had not been enough to kill an airfield defended by American Marines with shovels. Now Hyakutake would have to take it on the ground. His plan was intricate, almost too intricate. It required 3 separate forces to strike 3 separate points at exactly the same moment, in coordination across terrain that had already broken every previous Japanese operation on the island. The main force, under Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, would take 7,200 men from the Sendai Division on a march through the interior jungle. They would swing south of Henderson Field and attack from the rear, exactly as Kawaguchi had tried and failed to do a month earlier. But this time with more than twice as many men and heavier weapons. The Western force, under Colonel Nomasu Nakaguma, would take 3 battalions and 9 tanks across the sandbar at the mouth of the Matanakau River. Their job was to draw the American attention west, to pull Marines away from the main attack in the south. The 3rd Force, under Colonel Akinosuke Oka, would strike from the southwest and hit the American flank once the main attack broke through. Hyakutake set the attack for the night of October 23rd. He gathered his staff. He addressed them formally. He said, "The time of the decisive battle between Japan and the United States has come." Then he sent Maruyama into the jungle, and the jungle, as always, ate the plan alive. Maruyama's route was 15 miles through the interior of Guadalcanal. On a road, at a normal pace, that was a 5-hour march. In the jungle, it was something else entirely. His men dragged 70mm artillery pieces with ropes, because the guns were too heavy for men to carry, and there were no roads. They cut new paths through terrain where no path had ever existed. Every mile took hours. Every hour cost more men. And the jungle that had already broken Kawaguchi began to break the Sendai Division the same way, one exhausted man at a time. Radios failed in the humidity within days. Companies lost touch with battalions. Battalions lost touch with regiments. By the afternoon of October 23rd, Maruyama's main force was still miles from the American perimeter, exhausted, late, impossible to bring into position for a night attack. Maruyama sent runners with the message that the attack must be postponed by 24 hours. The runners reached most of his subordinate commanders in time. They did not reach Nakaguma. On the western flank, at the mouth of the Matanakau River, Colonel Nakaguma looked at his watch as the sun set on October 23rd. He had his orders. The attack was set for 1800 hours. It was now 1800 hours. He had no message telling him otherwise. He had 9 tanks lined up on the sandbar. He had 2,000 men ready to charge behind them. He gave the order. The tanks rolled forward. The American Marines on the far bank had been dug in for weeks. They had 37mm anti-tank guns. They had anti-tank mines. They had artillery observers with radios that worked. When the first Japanese tank rolled onto the sandbar, a Marine gun crew hit it with a shell that punched straight through the front armor. The tank stopped. Smoke poured from the hatch. The second tank tried to swerve around it. It hit a Marine anti-tank mine and blew apart. The third tank fired its main gun into the American positions, then turned to reverse, then took a shell in the engine deck and caught fire. One by one, all 9 tanks died on the sandbar. Behind them, the Japanese infantry was caught in the open. 40 American Marine howitzers, dug in and pre-registered on every yard of that sandbar, opened fire. 6,000 shells fell in less than an hour. 6,000 shells on 2,000 men. The Matanakau River ran red. Men who tried to swim across were shot in the water. Men who tried to retreat back into the jungle were caught by air-burst shells that killed them where they stood. By midnight, Nakaguma's attack was over. 600 Japanese soldiers were dead. The American Marines had lost fewer than 50 men. But the disaster on the western flank had done something worse than kill Nakaguma's men. It had warned the Americans. Along the southern perimeter, where Maruyama was still struggling to bring the Sendai Division into position, Marine officers looked at each other across their radios. If Nakaguma was attacking, that meant something bigger was coming. That meant the real attack was somewhere else. That meant they had one night, maybe less, to prepare for whatever was about to come out of the jungle at them. The man in command of the sector where the main attack would fall was named Louis Puller, 44 years old, lieutenant colonel. Marines called him Chesty because of his barrel chest and the way he walked. He had fought in Haiti and Nicaragua. He had been decorated 4 times. He was in command of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marine. Puller had 1,000 men. He was defending 1,800 yards of front, a frontage that would normally require an entire regiment. That evening, at 9:30 on October 24th, just hours before the assault would begin, a listening post in the jungle south of Puller's Line came alive on the field telephone. The voice belonged to Sergeant Ralph Briggs, Jr., Sergeant 26 years old, in command of a 4-man observation team hidden in the vegetation half a mile in front of the American Marine perimeter. His voice was flat, controlled, almost calm. He said, "Colonel, there are about 3,000 Japanese between you and me. They are singing and smoking cigarettes, and they are heading your way." Puller asked if he was certain. Briggs said, "Positive." Puller hung up the telephone. He turned to his officers. He said, "Let them come." At 1:15 in the morning on October 25th, the first wave hit the wire. And in the darkness, kneeling behind a Browning M1917 machine gun, a 24-year-old sergeant from Raritan, New Jersey, the son of an Italian-born tailor, put his hands on the trigger and prepared to do the job he had been trained to do. His name was John Basilone. He had not asked for this position. He had not chosen it. The choke point in front of his gun was not his idea. It had been assigned to him by the ordinary rotation of a Marine battalion's defensive layout. Any of a dozen machine gun sections could have been placed there instead. It was chance. It was mathematics. It was the accident of where a Marine officer had drawn a line on a map 3 weeks earlier. Basilone did not know that the ground in front of him was the single most important piece of dirt on the island. He did not know that if his guns failed, 3,000 Japanese soldiers would pour through the gap and reach Henderson Field before dawn. He did not know that the war in the Pacific and the lives of American Marines who had not yet been born would depend on what he did in the next 4 hours. He knew only that men were coming out of the darkness screaming, and it was his job to stop them. He pressed the trigger. The gun began to speak, and the Browning answered. And the men who had been told for 1,000 miles of Black Ocean and 1,000 years of samurai lore that spirit would beat steel learned in the space of a single heartbeat that they had been lied to. The first wave of the Sendai division came out of the elephant grass at a dead run. They did not stop. They did not take cover. They ran straight into the barbed wire because they had been told the wire could be crossed by throwing their bodies onto it. And so the first men did exactly that. They flung themselves onto the wire. They screamed as the barbs tore into their chests and their throats. And the men behind them ran across their backs like a bridge of flesh. John Basilone did not think. He fired. The Browning M1917 in front of him spat 500 rounds per minute into the space where men were trying to cross. The tracers were red. Every 5th round was a tracer. In the darkness, they looked like a line of fire drawn in the air, and wherever the line touched a man, the man came apart. The first wave died on the wire. The second wave came through the smoke of the first. They died too. The third wave came running over the bodies of the second. Basilone's number 2 gun jammed. He crawled to it in the mud. The barrel was so hot the metal glowed dull red in the dark. He cleared the jam with his bare hands. His palms blistered instantly. He did not stop. He racked the bolt. He resumed firing. Somewhere in the darkness in front of him, 3,000 men from the Sendai division were dying. And behind those 3,000 were 3,000 more. And Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama was screaming into a radio that no longer worked, ordering them forward, 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 because he could not accept what was happening. His plan had required coordination. The jungle had already destroyed his coordination. His plan had required surprise. Nakaguma's disaster on the Matanakau had already destroyed his surprise. His plan had required overwhelming force at a single point, and Basilone's guns and the guns of the American Marines on his left and his right, and the 40 howitzers behind them, ranged on every yard of the approach, were destroying his force one wave at a time. By 3 in the morning, the ground in front of the wire was carpeted with dead. The wounded crawled among them, some trying to reach the American lines to keep fighting, some trying to crawl back into the jungle to die in peace. Basilone's ammunition began to run low. He left his gun. He crawled 100 yards through Japanese wounded and Japanese dead to a supply dump behind the line. He filled his arms with belts of .30 caliber ammunition. He crawled back. He carried the belts draped around his neck like a scarf. When he reached his position, one of his gunners was dead. He took the man's place. He resumed firing. At some point in the darkness, he picked up the 90-pound Browning by its water jacket, still glowing hot, and moved it to a new position because the ground in front of the old one was blocked with corpses. His gloves burned through. The skin of his palms burned through. He did not feel it. There was no time to feel it. He kept firing. Dawn came slowly on October 25th. The gray light revealed what had happened in the darkness. In front of Basilone's position alone, 38 Japanese soldiers lay in a single heap, where his guns had caught them trying to cross a gap in the wire. Beyond them, hundreds more lay scattered across the approach, and beyond those, in the jungle, hundreds more had crawled away to die alone. Basilone had not slept in 3 days. He had not eaten in longer than that. When his gunners finally counted the brass at the bottom of his fighting hole, they estimated he had fired more than 26,000 rounds through the 2 guns of his section during the night. He was 24 years old. He said very little that morning. He drank some water. He looked at his hands, which no longer felt like hands. He asked if there were casualties in his section. There were. He nodded. He sat down against the wall of the fighting hole and closed his eyes for the first time in 72 hours. But the battle was not over. Maruyama still had thousands of men in the jungle, and on the night of October 25th, they came again. This time the attack fell across a wider front. Parts of 3 Japanese battalions hit Puller Sector. Another force hit the ridge to the west, held by the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marine. A third force struck the eastern flank, held by the 2nd Battalion, 164th Infantry Regiment. The 164th was an Army unit, not American Marines. Army. National Guardsmen from the state of North Dakota, part of the American Division. Farmers and mechanics and schoolteachers who had put on uniforms after Pearl Harbor and who had been on Guadalcanal for less than 2 weeks. Most of them had never seen combat. Some of them had never fired a rifle in anger. They were fed piecemeal into the line during the night, in the pouring rain, in the dark, in unfamiliar positions. The Japanese assumption had always been that mixed forces, Marines and Army together, would fall apart under pressure, that the 2 services would not fight for each other, that the Army boys especially would break. The Army boys did not break. The North Dakota farmers stood in the mud beside the American Marines and fired their rifles until their barrels smoked. The Marines beside them did not distinguish between them. Later, the American Marines would pay the 164th the highest compliment one American fighting man could pay another. They would say the North Dakota boys had fought like Marines. At his command post in the middle of the line, Chesty Puller sat on a wooden crate with a field telephone pressed to his ear and coordinated fire missions while bullets cracked overhead. A staff officer watching the situation on the map suggested that perhaps the line should be pulled back to a shorter perimeter. Puller looked at him. Puller told him the battalion was not retreating. Marines did not retreat. They would stay on this ridge, he said, and die there if it came to that. They did not die. Somewhere in front of the 2nd Battalion of the 29th Infantry Regiment, Major General Yumio Nasu was walking behind his men, urging them forward. Nasu was 50 years old, commander of the Infantry Brigade of the Sendai Division, a professional soldier, a man who had fought in China, a man who had marched with his men through 8 days of jungle to reach this ridge. An American artillery shell landed a few feet from him. Nasu was hit in the chest by a fragment. He did not die immediately. His aides carried him back into the jungle on a stretcher. He was dead before they reached the aid station. He was the first Japanese general to be killed in ground combat on Guadalcanal. And in the confusion of that same night, in the mud and the smoke and the tangle of bodies at the wire, an American Marine came out of the fighting carrying something folded and blood-soaked in his arms. He brought it back to a battalion command post. He handed it to a captain. The captain unfolded it, and inside was the regimental banner of the 29th Infantry Regiment of the Sendai Division, the colors themselves. To an American soldier, this was a trophy. To a Japanese soldier in the code by which the Imperial Army had lived for 70 years, the loss of a regimental banner was a spiritual death. It was the erasure of the regiment's soul. It was a shame that could not be atoned for. It had almost never happened in the history of the modern Japanese army. That night, it happened. By dawn on October 26th, the second night of the assault had failed. The bodies of the Sendai Division were stacked in the wire and along the approaches in numbers that no American Marine on Guadalcanal had ever seen. And still Maruyama did not stop. He had one more force to commit. On the far right, Colonel Akinosuke Oka had finally arrived after his own march through the jungle. 2,000 men, fresh in a relative sense. He was ordered to attack that night, the night of October 26th into 27th, the 3rd night in a row. His men charged the positions held by the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. The American Marines in that sector had been fighting for 3 straight nights. Their rifle barrels were worn. Their hands shook from exhaustion. Their eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of men who had killed too many people to remember any of them. They held their fire until Oka's soldiers reached the wire. Then they opened up. The attack disintegrated in less than an hour. The survivors retreated into the jungle, leaving hundreds more dead. On the morning of October 27th, Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama sat in his command post in the jungle and admitted, finally, that the Sendai division was destroyed. He ordered a withdrawal to the west, away from Henderson Field. He carried the news to Hyakutake in person because it was too shameful to send by radio. The 3-night battle for Henderson Field was over. The mathematics were staggering. The Japanese had lost somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men killed. The exact number was impossible to determine because so many bodies were never recovered from the jungle. The American Marines and Army soldiers who defended the airfield had lost fewer than 100 men. The kill ratio was at least 20-1. When burial details went out with counting tags, they gave up counting individually. They used bulldozers. They pushed the bodies into mass graves. The heat of the tropics had already begun the work of decomposition. The smell reached the airfield a mile away. Men flying Cactus aircraft out of Henderson said they could smell it in the cockpit at 1,000 feet. In one sector alone, the sector Puller had held, they counted 1,462 bodies, and still the war was not over. Henderson Field, battered and scarred and pocked with craters, was operating. The Cactus Air Force was flying. The runway that Yamamoto had tried to kill with 14-inch shells and that Hyakutake had tried to kill with the Sendai Division was still there. It was still American, and it was killing the Japanese Empire one ship at a time. The Japanese soldiers still on the island began to starve. The Tokyo Express could bring in men. It could not bring in enough rice. The Cactus Air Force made daylight movement impossible. Ships that tried to reach Guadalcanal in daytime were bombed. Ships that came at night could only unload a fraction of what was needed before they had to leave before dawn. The Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal began to call the island something new. They stopped calling it Guadalcanal. They began to call it Gato, the Starvation Island. They boiled the leaves of jungle plants and ate them. They killed and ate the horses that had been brought to pull artillery pieces. They caught rats and roasted them. Malaria killed men faster than American bullets. Dysentery emptied entire companies. Wounded men who could not walk were left in the jungle with a single grenade and a bow from their comrades. A Japanese medical officer began keeping a chart in his notebook. He wrote in it every day in careful character. The chart estimated the life expectancy of a Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal based on his condition. He wrote, "Those who can stand, 30 days. Those who can sit, 20 days. Those who can only urinate lying down, 3 days. Those who can no longer speak, tomorrow." By November, thousands were dying every week without a single American bullet being fired at them. In Tokyo, Yamamoto tried one more time to save the situation. On November 12th, he sent 2 more battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, to bombard Henderson Field the way Kongo and Haruna had done in October. But this time, the American Navy was waiting. The naval battles fought in the darkness off Guadalcanal between November 12th and 15th were among the most savage in the history of surface warfare. Ships fought at ranges so close that they could not depress their main guns low enough to hit each other. American cruisers rammed Japanese destroyers. Japanese destroyers put torpedoes into American battleships. Admiral Daniel Callaghan and Admiral Norman Scott, both American, were killed on their bridges within minutes of each other. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 7 destroyers. More than 1,700 American sailors died, but the Japanese lost Hiei, Sendai aircraft flying from Henderson Field. They lost Kirishima, sunk by the 16-inch guns of the American battleship Washington in a night action that lasted 7 minutes. And they lost most of the 11,000-man reinforcement convoy that was supposed to save the starving soldiers on Guadalcanal. 7 of 11 transports were sunk. Of the 7,000 men who reached the beach alive, only 2,000 carried any equipment at all. They arrived with no rice, no ammunition, no medicine. They joined the starving. By January of 1943, Tokyo faced a truth it could no longer avoid. Guadalcanal could not be held. It could not be saved. What remained of the Japanese army on the island had to be pulled off before it died to the last man. The evacuation was called Operation Key. Over 3 nights in early February, Japanese destroyers slipped down the slot one more time. They did not carry reinforcements. They carried empty landing craft. They took 10,652 men off the beaches of Guadalcanal in one of the most skillfully executed withdrawals of the Pacific War. They left behind 20,000 dead. Some of those dead had been killed by American Marines. Most had starved. For John Basilone, the war did not end at Guadalcanal. He received the Medal of Honor in a ceremony in Australia in May of 1943. He was the first living enlisted American Marine to receive the medal in the Second World War. He was sent back to the United States for a war bond tour. He was photographed with movie stars. He was paraded through cities. He was offered a commission as an officer. He was offered a job training recruit stateside for the rest of the war. He refused. He said, "I am not an officer, and I am not a museum piece," he said. "I belong back with my outfit." The Marine Corps sent him back. They assigned him to the 5th Marine Division, which was training for an assault on a small volcanic island in the Western Pacific that most Americans had never heard of. Its name was Iwo Jima. On February 19, 1945, John Basilone landed on Red Beach 2 on Iwo Jima. He led his section off the beach under fire. He knocked out a Japanese blockhouse with grenades. He was moving forward with his men when a Japanese mortar round landed among them. He was killed instantly. He was 28 years old. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He is the only enlisted American Marine of the Second World War to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. The airfield he had defended in October of 1942 is still there. The runway is longer now. The buildings are made of concrete. It is called Honiara International Airport. It serves the capital of the Solomon Islands. Tourists fly in on commercial jets. They rent cars. They go to the beach. They have no idea that the ground under the tarmac was once soaked with the blood of an empire. But the lesson of Henderson Field is still there in the record for anyone who cares to read it. The Japanese made a huge mistake in 1942. Their mistake was not that they were not brave. They were brave. Their mistake was not that they were not skilled. They were skilled. Their mistake was not even that they attacked. Given their strategic position in the summer of 1942, they had to attack. Their mistake was that they believed their own propaganda. They believed the Americans were soft. They believed spirit would defeat industry. They believed one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. They believed the racial theories their newspapers had printed for 20 years. And they sent their best division, the Sendai Division, into a killing ground defended by American Marines with machine guns and artillery. And they told those soldiers to charge because Japanese spirit would carry them through. Japanese spirit did not carry them through. 20,000 round belts of .30 caliber ammunition and 40 howitzers ranged on every approach, and one American Marine sergeant named John Basilone, kneeling behind a Browning M1917 in the mud. Those things carried the dead. The Japanese soldiers who died on the wire in front of Henderson Field were not defeated by weakness. They were defeated by a country that had built shipyards on both coasts and factories in every major city, and that could put an airfield back into operation 12 hours after a battleship bombardment. They were defeated by the exact thing Yamamoto had warned them about before Pearl Harbor and that no one in Tokyo had wanted to hear. They were defeated by America. In 1942, Japan attacked America's Henderson Field. It was a huge mistake, and it cost them the war.